Chapter 9. The Meeting. How many times had Jinshi heard that something was for his own safety? For more than a month now he had led a life that bordered on house arrest. He wasn't to go anywhere outside of Gyokuyen's annex. Occasionally he might be invited to the main house or the administrative office, but at such times he would be accompanied by a panoply of soldiers. Certainly enough to keep him from doing anything unscripted. Even from the brief glimpses he got out of his carriage as he went from one building to another, he gained a sense of the destruction, but he knew that, in any other case, it would have been much worse. Jinshi had come to the western capital in part on the assumption that this insect plague was going to occur. He'd looked into old records about past plagues. They described entire crops annihilated, people so desperately hungry that they resorted to cannibalism. It was no exaggeration when people said that a plague of insects could destroy an entire country. Naturally, the dissatisfaction and anger were directed chiefly at the imperial family, which stood atop the national hierarchy. That was why Jinshi continued to submit to his confinement. At the moment, Gyokuoyu controlled what he could do. Nobody in Jinshi's entourage liked it, some of them even regarded Gyokuoyu as a half-baked stage hero. But Jinshi had his position to think of. As the emperor's younger brother, he was supposedly here to survey things in the western capital. As such, he was, ultimately, a guest. If he did anything to contravene that role, it could come back to haunt him later. Or at least, so he had believed. "I think you're letting them upstage you a bit too thoroughly, Moon Prince," Chu said, although her face betrayed nothing. She sat across from him in the carriage, which was also occupied by a bodyguard and a second lady-in-waiting. Although it was neither Suiren nor Daomai, he'd chosen his most capable people in response to a very unexpected situation. In this case, Gaoshiren accompanied him as his bodyguard. That would normally be Basin's role, but Basin would not have meshed well with the person they were going to meet. Basin was angrier than anyone at the way Jinshi had been treated in the western capital. He might be physically strong, but right now Jinshi needed someone who could keep their emotions in check. At this rate, people are going to think a helpless princeling bumbled in from the royal capital just to play a supporting part to Master Gyokuoyu. With a dexterous flick, several small pieces of jade appeared between Chu's fingers. Her hand worked busily, more emerged, then a few disappeared. "I know," Jinshi said. That was precisely why he was on his way to the administrative office. Yes, Jinshi was there as a guest, but he liked to think he had done all he could for the western capital. He'd offered them provisions that he had brought specifically for that purpose, and they had promptly been distributed. He'd sent messengers to nearby villages to help ascertain the extent of the damage, and then calculated how much food each location would need based on those assessments. He was glad he had brought a capable civil official like Bayu. The reason help had been so quick in coming from the royal capital was because Jinshi had dispatched a post horse the moment he'd heard from Lahan's brother. If, at that point, nothing had happened, if there had been no swarm, it would have been easy to dismiss as a mistake on the part of the imperial family. The possibility of a swarm of insects had been a topic of conversation among the emperor and some of his closest advisors and subordinates, and they had been aware of the possibility that it would strike in the western capital. But the decision to request support had fallen to Jinshi alone. He'd had no guarantees that the swarm would arrive, in which case, the supply ship might even have been refused permission to dock. Therefore, and at the risk of sullying his own reputation, Jinshi had decided to allow Gyokuoyu to take control of events. When Gyokuoyu's messenger had come to him shortly after the swarm arrived, Jinshi reported that he was safe and asked if it would be acceptable for him to request support from the royal capital. He also conveyed to Gyokuoyu that he would like the governor to receive the supplies. So it was that the provisions Jinshi had prepared and procured, Gyokuoyu distributed. Those who had come with Jinshi from the capital and knew the truth were furious, but this was the western capital. Even if Jinshi had tried to undertake the food handouts himself, he didn't have enough people to do it. He hadn't brought enough servants to cook and give out all that food. The quickest and best way to get it to the people who needed it was to work with Gyokuoyu. The thing that most terrified people during a natural disaster was the uncertainty. Just being able to get a bowl of kanji and a bit of rice would do much to relieve the anxiety. Then there was the matter of market prices. Jinshi had received his share of exasperation for having no idea what things cost, but he'd been working on it the last few years and liked to think he was getting better. Even in the capital with all its wealth there were starving children who begged on the streets with empty rice bowls, or nightwalkers with their faces hidden who beckoned customers into dark corners, or parents who sold their own children to brothels. If he hadn't seen enough of it from his carriage as he passed by, he'd witnessed more than his fill by walking those streets himself. Jinshi had worn fine silk all his life, had always had clear soup to drink every night and kanji without any fillers. Even now, he was at no risk of starving, unlike everyone else in the western capital. Why? What was it all for? He would do best to throw away foolish pride. If Gyokuoyu wanted to stand in the limelight, then let him. Better for Jinshi to let himself be used like a tool than to stubbornly, selfishly refuse to help. In fact, perhaps it was Jinshi who was doing the using. Let the emperor's younger brother be useless. Who cared if the people mocked him? Far better he be someone no one would desire to manipulate. What would Basin think of all this? He'd be mad with rage, perhaps, but, unable to strike Jinshi in his anger, he would destroy anything else in the room that wasn't nailed down. Jinshi, for his part, rather liked the name Jinshi. Even if it was an identity he'd concocted to fool the eunuchs and the ladies in the emperor's garden. He preferred Jinshi, a name people could say, to Kei Zuijetsu, which none could speak. Even if he knew that making himself approachable and easy to talk to was a pointless exercise. Time passed as he ruminated, until he found himself at his destination, the administrative office. We're here. Chu looked outside and grinned. Jinshi deliberately adjusted his mindset. Approachable he might be, but they were not going to take him for a fool. He was shown to a room with a round table. Gyokuoyu and Laken were already seated. Laken, apparently with time to kill, was working Go problems. In a corner of the room waited bureaucrats with papers of some kind. Gaoshiren and Chu traded a look. This didn't feel like the last time they had met Gyokuoyu, or the time before that. They were especially curious about Laken. It wasn't always possible to predict how the fickle genius would behave, and that made it even harder to guess why he was at this table. My apologies for summoning you here, Gyokuoyu said, rising to his feet. Already, Jinshi knew it had been the right choice not to bring Basin. To have been sitting at all when a member of the imperial family entered the room could be considered a sign of disrespect. On that note, Laken showed no sign of looking up from his Go problems. What might I do for you? Jinshi asked. If this is about the insect swarm, I've brought some materials relating to the matter. Gaoshiren produced the papers. They concerned some preliminary calculations about the food handouts that Jinshi and his people had made. They also described research into hardy crops that were quick to go from planting to harvest, food that might help provide famine relief if the provisions proved insufficient. In this, Maomao's and Lahan's brothers' knowledge had proved invaluable. Finally, there were some reports about medicine and other things that would need to be supplied once the food situation was addressed. Yes. You've been a great help to us in the face of this disaster, Moon Prince. I never imagined aid would come so rapidly from the central reaches. Well, Jinshi had. Because he had requested the support several days before mentioning the matter to Gyokuoyu. He'd been banking on the fact that the request would spend at least that long in committee when it reached the royal capital. Are you in need of further supplies? Jinshi asked. He'd reviewed the reports himself. The current stock of provisions was expected to hold out only 2 or 3 months at most, but there was a limit to how much support could be provided. The real solution was to get some crops growing as quickly as they could. I do wish to ask you for more support, if I might. In the form of personnel. Personnel? How do you mean? True, Gyokuoyu was clearly short-staffed, but just sending in new folks willy-nilly wouldn't solve the problem. If he wanted more farmers, it would be better to teach the locals than bring in outsiders. I need soldiers, Gyokuoyu said. Why? You need help suppressing bandits. Food shortages tended to make the gulf between the haves and have-nots especially apparent. As the poor began to starve, they would soon turn to crime. The whole reason Jinshi had hurried to provide extra food was to blunt that possibility, to fill people's stomachs before they turned to violence. Gyokuoyu gave Jinshi a smile that verged on a leer. It was an expression one would never have seen from his father. It was the look not of a merchant but of a soldier, of a man less interested in kindness and decency than Marshal Vaylor. A bureaucrat behind Gyokuoyu handed him a large piece of paper. "I'd like you to take a look at this," Gyokuoyu said, and placed the paper on the table. It was a map of Isei province, with several areas circled in ink. Some of the circles were black and some were red, with more red circles the farther one went to the west. Laken said thoughtfully, looking up from his Go problems. "Bandit attacks." Precisely. They had circled everywhere an incident had taken place. "Judging by the locations, I take it the red ones are incursions by foreign tribes." "Your mind is every bit as sharp as they say, sir." Gyokuoyu looked at Laken, visibly pleased. The strategist normally seemed like a doddering fool, but when it came to reading human behavior, he had no peer. So the red circles were attacks believed to have been perpetrated by foreigners. True, Isei province was located right on the border, but even at that, the number of red circles seemed inordinately large to Jinshi. "Are they getting more frequent?" he asked. "They are," Gyokuoyu confirmed. "There were a good number last year as well, but this year has been particularly bad. We'd made some, modest military preparations, but there couldn't have been a worse time for an insect plague." Jinshi had heard talk that conscriptions were increasing, but to hear such words from the governor's own mouth left him speechless. Gyokuoyu was no fool. "I think we can safely assume that the swarm has driven those reprobates into Li," said Gyokuoyu. The swarm had covered a wide area, and the less prepared a place was, the worse the damage would be. Certainly other countries would have been hit at least as hard as their own, and possibly even worse. "Then these soldiers you want are for the suppression of the tribes?" Jinshi asked. There had been such an excursion some years before, but that had been merely about pushing the foreigners back. As he recalled, it hadn't gone to Isei province, but the western edge of Shihoku province. Gyokuoyu, however, said, "No," and laid down another map. This one showed an even larger area, including Shao, Hokueren, and Ainan. "What would you say if we aimed here?" He pointed squarely at Shao. Jinshi looked at him. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "Well, it's as you can see on this map. The western reaches of Isei province have been the hardest hit. With the swarm having savaged every country around us, importing food is going to be difficult. So, what, then? Do we try to transport provisions overland? It would likely be impossible to transport enough food, and if attacks from the tribes weren't enough, an invasion by a foreign country was also a real possibility. Isei province's hard-won food would be stolen. What's the quickest way to get provisions to this western area?" Gyokuoyu asked. "I believe it's not by land, but by sea." And there sat Shao, a central hub of trade, well connected to other places by both land and water. Yes, having free use of Shao's harbors would certainly make it much easier to ensure a stable supply of food. Shao, however, would exact a heavy fee for the use of its harbors. Not to mention the likelihood that many of them were already dedicated to shoring up Shao's own internal supply problems in the wake of the plague. "You're suggesting we start a war for this?" Jinshi kept his voice as level as he could. He had been more than ready to cede center stage to Gyokuoyu, to let him be in charge, but this was beyond the pale. In order to put food in his people's mouths, he was proposing thievery. It would make him no different from the bandits he despised. "Oh, you're against the idea? I seem to recall it is you yourself, Moon Prince, who has the greatest grievance against Shao." "The ripest reason to go to war." Gyokuoyu oozed confidence. Jinshi knew what he was referring to, the Shaonese shrine maiden. He'd allowed her to die last year, and it had left Shao with leverage over him. Jinshi suspected, however, that Gyokuoyu did not know that the shrine maiden was in fact alive, and secretly taking refuge in Li. "It was another Shaonese woman who killed the shrine maiden," Gyokuoyu said. "I grant she had been admitted to the rear palace as a consort, but surely Li can't be held accountable for everything a woman from a foreign country might do. Certainly, Li had come off the worst in the opinion of the wider world, and the imperial family in particular had been embarrassed. Shao used the murder of their shrine maiden to try to blackmail our country. More than reason enough to go to war, I would say. But you wouldn't, imperial younger brother." Depending on the era, a reason to go to war could be nearly anything. After all, simply besmirching the ruling family could get an entire clan wiped out. Now Gyokuoyu turned to the strategist. What do you think, Sir Laken? Laken once again stopped working his Go problems and studied the map intently. He wore the same look with which he would appraise a board game. He reached out to his aide, who gave him a bag. There were shogi pieces inside. I don't know about your reasons or excuses. All I know is how to win at shogi, Laken said, and then he started arranging the pieces on the map. The aide gave Jinshi an apologetic look. There was no malice in Laken, but neither was there virtue. So long as something didn't harm him or his family, he paid it no mind. If there was a chance to participate in an interesting game, however, that he wouldn't miss. Jinshi saw now why Gyokuoyu had included Laken in this conference. To the strategist, war was just a combination of his favorite games. It was a shogi match using human pieces, and a game of Go in which you captured real territory. If you would stand at our head, Moon Prince, I have no doubt the people of the West would rally behind you. This, then, was what Gyokuoyu was really aiming at with Jinshi. Don't you think that the people wish to behold you not merely as a visitor, but as a leader? There was one thing that Gyokuoyu seemed to have misunderstood. He believed Jinshi was eager for people to see him in his true guise. He was trying to flatter Jinshi's pride as part of the imperial family. If you should step forth, I would support you wholeheartedly. I would be your right hand, Gyokuoyu said, his gaze piercing. Jinshi found himself wondering if Gyokuoyu truly was related to Gyokuyu. She, too, could be strong-willed, but she was nothing like this. Jinshi could see it in Gyokuoyu's eyes. He wanted war. He was eager for it. I may summon soldiers, but people live here. Yes, they do. Our western lands are home to many loyal hearts. They may be merely farmers, but if the need were to arise, a great many of them would lend you their strength. Imagine you leading us and Sir Laken formulating our strategy. And finally, though I grant our power be modest, the Yu clan would stand to aid you. The Yu clan. Gyokuien might have started life as a merchant, but he had influence all over Isei province. His current power might even surpass that of the Yi, who had been destroyed 17 years before. Jinshi narrowed his eyes. Tell me, does Sir Gyokuen know about this plan? There was the slightest twitch of Gyokuoyu's eyebrow. My father has long spoken of what we might gain if we could extend our reach into Shao's territory. Ah. So he doesn't know. And yet the whole clan of you would stand by me. Jinshi, drawing on his experiences in that den of women, the rear palace, remained resolutely calm. Compared to the lies women told, men's braggadocio was rough, their façades easy to poke holes in. A sea route, he said. Yes, the benefits would be great. It does make one wish for Shao's harbors, doesn't it? But it would come at too high a price. What of the other countries with which Shao shares a land border? They might cease to send trade goods. And then there's the question of attacking a nation that has made itself studiously neutral, as Shao has. Would we not be seen as barbarians who refused to respect the agreements? Sir Gyokuien, I feel sure, would weigh all these things carefully in his calculations. Gyokuen, as we've said, was a merchant at heart, and he knew better than to fixate on the profit right in front of his eyes. He would be sure to ask what he would sacrifice to gain it. Even if his son had written to him seeking his advice on this matter, Jinshi was confident that Gyokuen would have told him that it was too soon for such a move. Jinshi thought he caught a flicker in Gyokuoyu's eyes at the mention of his father's name. He thought the other man was the slightest bit shaken. Gyokuoyu adopted a discontented air. Jinshi, meanwhile, refused to let his expression soften. The emperor's younger brother he might be, but he knew that even so, Gyokuoyu would view him as a young upstart, hardly half his own age. Perhaps he thought he could overwhelm Jinshi with sheer presence. He could not. I'm here as a representative of the central region, but I am also His Majesty's eyes, and it would not be fitting for the eyes to take it upon themselves to command. The words His Majesty sent a shiver through the bureaucrats waiting nearby. All of them hailed from the western capital, meaning that they were Gyokuoyu's allies, and presumably viewed Jinshi as little more than an insouciant child. There was audible muttering when the child pushed back against their own master. Gaoshuren gave Jinshi the faintest of smiles. Perhaps he had a bit less heartburn now. Chu could spare them the raised thumb, though. Gyokuoyu would not be put off so easily. You say, then, that as the emperor's eyes, you cannot make decisions on your own? Yes, Definitely the right choice to leave Basin behind. He would have risen to this obvious provocation and only made things worse. I say this because I have decided. Have you determined that an attack upon Shao would do more good than harm? A merchant must be skilled at such calculations. Jinshi returned taunt for taunt. He knew he was very much on Gaokoyu's home ground here, and he had no desire to engage in a losing battle. He wished he had reinforcements at this moment. If we attack Shao, I cannot imagine Hokueren will stand quietly by. That ragtag confederation of barbarians skulking in the north? What have we to fear from them? Fair enough. You know, there's an animal that can be hunted up in Hokueren, the red deer. Its horns make an excellent energy tonic, one prepared every night for the emperor and his ladies in the rear palace. There was no small self-deprecation in Jinshi's remark. He'd spent years pretending to be a eunuch. He knew how to let ridicule roll off his back. Then there's the tigers. They have very large ones up north. The bones are used in making wine. It was called, appropriately enough, tiger bone wine, and it was said to be highly nourishing. Needless to say, Jinshi had become quite knowledgeable about medicines. A physician with extensive experience of medicines taught me, so it was quite effective, he said. Strictly speaking, it hadn't been a physician, but his point was made. Moreover, he wasn't so sure whether the elixir had been effective or not. He'd left it to the chefs in the rear palace to serve the medicinal meals. Medicines and alcohol, Laken muttered. Say, Onsu. Once this war starts, will we still be able to get those things? We may be able to, sir, but they'll probably be much more expensive, his aide replied. Medicine tends to be scarce in times of war. It's hard on doctors and apothecaries. I see. Laken returned the shogi pieces he'd been placing into the bag they came from and stood up. Onsu was a highly capable aide-de-camp. He'd naturally understood what Jinshi was trying to communicate to Laken. What seems to be the matter, Sir Laken? Gaokuoyu asked, puzzled. Sorry. I'm leaving, Laken said, and with that, he turned and went. Master Laken, wait for me, Onsu cried, chasing after him. The Westerners had hardly picked their jaws up off the floor when Jinshi stood as well. It seems our strategist is in no mood for war. Perhaps I might also be on my way, then? Gaokuoyu said nothing. Jinshi decided to take that to mean that he could go. He didn't look like he liked that very much, Chu whispered. Sadly for Gaokuoyu, if there was one realm in which Jinshi had far more experience than he did, it was what made Laken tick.